And this was a question that was sent into our other website, which is dedicated to questions and answers. It's just called Ask John Mackay. We can put that up later on, the link to that. But this was a question that was sent in. Polar bears have evolved to live in cold climates if God made an ice-free world. Now, remember, John gave you a bit of the biblical history of the world. It started out very good. Ice is not a good place to live. So there wouldn't have been huge glaciers and snow-capped mountains and all of those things. They're not good places to live. So this person wrote in this question and then asked, well, can these things live in warmer climates? Because we always think of them as living in colder climates. And that's exactly what we have in the world today. Where do the polar bears live? Up amongst the snow and the ice. And they have quite an extensive range. So if we look at the world from above the top, as it were, above the North Pole, so we're looking down at the Earth, and so the land masses look a little bit distorted, but you can sort of work out where we are. We have Canada and Russia and Alaska right up near the top of the world, surrounding the North Pole, and we have Greenland. And the polar bears live along the coastal regions. In fact, their name is, their scientific name, the Ursus maritimus, meaning maritime bears. So they live along these coastal regions around the North Pole, around the Arctic Ocean. So yes, these days they do live in very cold places where there's lots of snow and ice. So how did that happen if originally there was an ice-free, very good world? Could they live in warmer climates? Well, how do they live in the cold climate for a start? Because they obviously do. They survive there quite well in spite of all of the scare stories that we hear about them dying out. You ask the people who live up amongst them, and they know very well that they're doing quite well in some areas. It's patchy, but anyway, they have very thick fur. They certainly have a couple of layers of fur, very, very thick, really good insulation. And as you saw in John's presentation there, underneath that white fur is actually black skin. But the thick fur is very good insulation. Then they have another insulating layer, which is a layer of subcutaneous fat. So that's a layer of fat underneath the skin. It's very, very thick. And to maintain that, they live on a high-fat diet. They go out onto their sea ice and they hunt seals. But they are not exclusive carnivores, and we need to remember that. They will basically eat whatever they can, and if they can't go and hunt for seals, they will eat anything that they find. They'll eat plants, they'll eat dead birds, they'll eat eggs of birds that live around the region. That they'll eat whatever they can, and in human areas where people live, that they are actually a bit of a menace, because they'll come in and try and eat the rubbish and the human food as well, so they are omnivores rather than exclusive carnivores. So they do survive in a cold climate reasonably well because they are already equipped to be able to do that. But they also live in warm climates. I've seen real polar bears, but I've never been up to the north of Alaska or the regions around the poles. The place where I saw them was actually in a very warm place on the Gold Coast in Queensland, near where John Mackay lives, where there's a marine park called SeaWorld, but I've also seen them in zoos. And they are in zoos around the world in some quite warm places, but zoos, and they live quite well. The zoos provide water for swimming. They like swimming, and they're quite good at it. So as long as they have lots of water to swim in, they are also fed a much lower fat diet, and that includes vegetables. And you can actually look up the website that for SeaWorld in Queensland, and they have their own page about the polar bears, and they just name the different polar bears that live in SeaWorld, and they describe what their favourite food is for each bear. And in amongst things like fish, which you would expect, are watermelons and figs and olive oil and various other vegetable type things. Now, every now and again, in the hot summer in Australia, private companies and individuals can get themselves a bit of free goodwill publicity by donating a huge amount of ice for the polar bears that live in SeaWorld, and they do like that. So the zoos provide the right sort of environment, provide the sort of diet that enables them to cope in the warm climate, and the bears respond to the warm climate. They can adjust the thickness of their coat. In fact, all mammals can do this. They do respond to changes in the environment. Now, that is a true adaptation in that it is a genuine change that happens within a living thing, but adaptation is actually a design feature. You can't develop the ability to do that after the event, as it were. You've already got to have that built in for it to be of any use to you. So they can adjust the thickness of their coat, and they can adjust the thickness of the subcutaneous fat in response to living in a warmer climate. So they can actually survive quite well. And of course, the other thing that we know about polar bears is their white fur. And the interesting thing is the polar bear hair is not white because it's full of white stuff. It just lacks pigment in the hair itself. Now, as you saw in John's presentation, they're capable of producing pigment. It's actually in their skin, but it's missing in the hair follicles, so they don't produce pigment. And the skin or the hairs also contain air bubbles. So that makes the hairs quite reflective. Now, that's interesting because that's how those of us who have reached a certain age where you start to go mature blonde, otherwise known as grey hairs, that's how grey hairs are formed, actually. The hair follicles no longer produce pigment, and you do get air bubbles forming in the hair, and so they become more reflective. So don't think of your grey hairs as as a sign of age. Well, they are a sign of age, but think of them as polar bear hairs if you want to think of them as a little bit more exotic. So how can we relate this to the biblical history of the world? Why do the polar bears live in this icy, freezing, cold regions now if they started out in an ice-free region? Well, it's probably a mixture of a change in the environment and a change in the bears themselves. If we think about it, after Noah's flood, right, bears moved north and spread out. They live, the natural habitat for them is all in the northern hemisphere. They have been spread around the world to places like SeaWorld, which is in the southern hemisphere, by people shifting them there, but their natural habitat is in the northern hemisphere. So bears got off the ark just like all of the other animals that were on the ark, and they spread out over so the original population of bears, which would have got off the ark and bred and started to spread out over the world, they moved north and they spread out in those regions, east and west. And at the same time, the climate was degenerating, and we got the coming of ice and snow. Now, notice we said about the polar bear hair, right? It's lost its color. The pigment cells do not, even though the bear is capable of producing pigment, something has happened to their hair follicles where they don't produce pigment. So that's not a gain in structure, having the white hair. It's actually a loss. So we've got degeneration in the in the bears themselves. And so it's interesting, the genetic studies they're doing now of polar bears and brown bears. And brown bears includes grizzly bears, particularly in North America, but this would apply in Russia as well. They've done genetic studies, and there are genetic similarities between brown bears and polar bears. And that would make sense, of course, because they are all the one kind. So how come there is this sort of separation between brown bears and polar bears? Well, there's nothing much that's going to hunt and eat bears, but they do need a bit of camouflage from human hunters, actually. And brown bears are much easier to camouflage themselves. I'm not sure where that sound came from, but anyway, brown bears are much easier to hide themselves in a forest because you've got dark light and shadows, and also brown rocks and brown trees and things like that. Whereas a white bear would stand out in amongst the normal sort of environment that you would get in a forested region. So it would be easier for them to be hunted down by human beings. And in fact, these days you do occasionally get brown bears that just lose their colour, still living in the forested and green areas. But eventually the polar bears, the white bears, would survive better in places which are further away from human habitation. So that would be the high Arctic, where there aren't many people. And so it's more likely a survival thing that they ended up in the very high Arctic, whereas brown bears stayed in the slightly lower latitudes. And if you look at the current range of polar bears and brown bears, right, yes, the polar bears do live right up there amongst Greenland, all of those northern islands of Canada and the northern coastline of Alaska and of Russia. But their ranges do overlap, and they can actually interbreed. And when they have been together in zoos, they can actually breed and produce fertile offspring. And again, that fits with the biblical history that they are really part of the one kind. So there are hybrids of brown bears and polar bears. There are good genetic studies of living brown bears, polar bears, and these hybrids. And they're also starting to do genetic studies from archaeological sites where they've found old bones of polar bears and brown bears, and they're pushing it back further and further. There was a recent story, they're trying to make a polar bear skull that they claim was 100,000 years old, had the mix of these genes. So no one's disputing that polar bears and brown bears are related to one another, and the hybrids have this sort of light brown or patchy brown sort of colour. So if we look at polar bears in the big picture of the history of the world, they were created for the good world. They could live in the good world quite well. They probably weren't white then, but there would have been variation in their coat colour. So they were originally created for the good world. They are now surviving in the fallen world or the cursed world, where we do have extremes of climate, where we do have ice and snow. So let's move on to another creature that lives amongst the ice and snow, and those are the penguins. Now, in our so whereabouts do penguins live? Well, they live in the ice and snow as well. And recently there was a story in National Geographic about penguins going south. And this was, as I said at the beginning, polar bears and penguins are used in the sort of climate debate a lot by the climate activists, that they are endangered and they're losing their habitat and it's all our fault. And this was an article in National Geographic last year. And the author of this was writing about his experience of actually sailing down to Antarctica. And he referred to a group of penguins called Gentoo penguins, and he said they're waddling further south into areas that were once too icy for them. And the article then went on to say, but the population of chin-strap penguins and the sleek black-headed Adelie penguins, which depend on sea ice, are declining. So he's telling this bad news story, right? Penguins are going south. They are declining. Well, let's check that out. So how far south can you go when you live in Antarctica? Well, Antarctica is about as south as you can possibly go. It's right on the bottom of the world. If we get orientated here, you can see the southern hemisphere. There, Australia on one side, South Africa on the other side, and Antarctica is right on the bottom. So it's as south as you can go. If you go any further than that, well, you sort of either fall off the bottom end of the planet, or if you keep going on the planet, you end up going north again. So I'm not quite sure what the problem was that polar bears were, penguins were moving south. They're already south as south as you can go. Now, penguins, like polar bears, also live in coastal regions. And you have to remember that Antarctica is not a large ice sheet. Like the Arctic Ocean is covered in ice at the moment, but it is an ocean. However, Antarctica is actually a land mass. So if all that ice melted that you can see there on that picture there, it's one of those satellite photos that's been put together by a whole lot of other photos. If all of that ice melted, there would be a landmass there. And the polar bears can just live on the coast. They'd be perfectly happy to do that. Sorry, I'm getting the polar bears and penguins mixed up again, aren't I? Okay, the penguins. We're in penguin land, right. So let's have a look at the conservation status from the Australian Antarctic Program to check out the statement about them declining. Adelie penguins, you can look up the Australian Antarctic Program website, and it will list all these different species, and the conservation status is, quote unquote, least concerned. In other words, the Australian Antarctic Program aren't considering that these things are in trouble or declining. Now, what about the chin-strap penguins? Now, aren't they rather cute? They have this little line underneath their beak there, so that's hence the name. And this is a quote from the Australian Antarctic Program website. Chin-strap penguins are an abundant penguin species in the Antarctic and sub-Antarctic regions. Now, sub doesn't mean further south. It means in the regions that are there before you get to Antarctica, in the islands, in the Southern Ocean. And again, their conservation status is described as least concerned. So where do penguins live? Well, some of them live in the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are actually in the tropics. And you can see from this photo here, that looks like a very warm, balmy place. It's actually only a couple of degrees below the equator. So in their natural environment, all penguins do actually live below the equator, but some of them only just below the equator. They live in the southern hemisphere. A lot of them do live further south. Now, why do they do that? Again, it's like the polar bears. When animals spread out over the earth, they spread out to wherever they could survive. So here is the current range of penguins, and you can see it's very extensive. A lot of them live in the islands in the Southern Ocean, which is why they've coloured the area around Antarctica, the Antarctic Ocean there. They live in the southern regions of Australia, around New Zealand, in South Africa, all the way up the western edge of South America and onto the Galapagos Islands, so up into just underneath the equator. So they can live in quite warm places and they can live in very cold places. They live wherever they can survive. And because they have the ability to survive in cold weather, and because they, same way as the polar bears do, they have good insulation, they have good from subcutaneous fat and from feathers rather than fur, and they live on a diet of fish, so they have a high-fat diet, they can survive. So again, penguins were created for the good world. They can live in warm environments as well as cold environments, but they are now surviving in the fallen world, and so they do survive in places where there aren't things that are going to go eating them, and so that's why they are abundant down in the Southern Ocean and down along the shores of Antarctica. But as long as they can live in the coastal regions, as long as there's coastal regions for them to live on, and as long as there's a sea full of fish for them to fish in, they will survive.